Spring football is approaching just around the corner. Don't have a specific date yet from Notre Dame as they're dealing with some COVID issues on campus. So still expecting spring ball to start sometime in late March, Lou. So we do this Irish huddle every Thursday, so we're going to be breaking down each position group, and this week is quarterbacks and running backs. We're going to pair them up in two. So we'll start with quarterbacks, and three talking points for each of these, Lou. We're just kind of open the floor up, and then we're going to get into the X factor of the group, and then is this unit better than 2020? So I think that'll be an interesting discussion. But starting with the quarterbacks, Lou, you don't have a ton of returning experience on the roster, of course, other than Jack Coan. And a big reason why you don't have returning experience because Ian Book was so darn durable, and he didn't really miss any games, and had a solid career. So are you kind of ready post Ian Book to cover a quarterback battle?
Yeah, that's always going to be the most intrigue in any spring, even if it's somebody like Ian Book who's established. It's like you were looking at last spring as, okay, who is it going to be for the number two back? Is it going to be Brendan Clark or is it going to be Drew Pyne? And then of course there was only one spring practice last year before the pandemic hit, and then it was canceled thereafter. This year, I think deep down, everybody knows or senses that Jack Coan is going to be the starter. You don't bring somebody in from a Power Five program who has 18 career starts under his belt in comparison to, I think Brendan Clark has something like 37 career snaps, and Drew Pyne has like 26 last year in kind of reserve or mop up duty roles. So there's not really going to be a lot of mystery there. The coaches will say the right things, as they should, about, it's an open competition and all, but there's a purpose for having him as the bridge between the 3-year Ian Book era from 2018 to 2020, and then whoever takes over from 2022 on.
Yeah, there's a look on the screen for our YouTube audience at Jack Coan. Um, I agree. It's going to be him as the starting quarterback, but then you look at the number two guy for this season. You still have Brendan Clark, and you return Drew Pyne as well, and then bring in Tyler Buchner and Ron Paulus. This is a big group of scholarship quarterbacks, Lou. I mean, how are they going to give all these guys reps in the spring?
Well, it's interesting because this is really the first time since Brian Kelly's second spring in 2011 where he has that many scholarship quarterbacks. I remember Brian Kelly then specifically stating that you can't have more than 4 scholarship quarterbacks because there just are not enough reps to go around. And back then you had Tommy Rees, Andrew Hendricks, Everett Golson, Gunnar Kiel, who was an early enrollee, and Luke Massa from the same class as Andrew Hendricks and Tommy Rees. And what they did was move Luke to wide receiver. I think at that time you also had Nate Montana, and they wanted to move him as well, but it's sort of like he went to another school, the University of Montana, probably appropriately enough, because again, it's the number of reps that you're trying to get in. And now you have 5 quarterbacks here again. Now, potentially Brendan Clark, he had that quote unquote cranky knee at the end of last season where he was put in a brace, and Brian Kelly said it would be needed to be cleaned up. So I would imagine that might limit him as far as reps for this spring, because both Buchner and Paulus are going to be early entrants. So they will be available for spring practice to go along with Jack Coan and, of course, Drew Pyne.
Yeah, you mentioned Clark there. I spaced on that, Lou. I'm not expecting him to be available much during the spring, as you mentioned, with the knee. But yeah, you bring in a couple of true freshmen. Tyler Buchner, 6'2", 205-pound true freshman. The next coming of whatever you want to, insert here. And then Ron Paulus, the third, 6'3", 230-pounder, of course, from South Bend. We all know his father. So expectations for the two true freshmen this spring, Lou. I think we're in agreement that Paulus is coming in on scholarship. That is confirmed, but it feels like he is a guy that, and you've done the math, Lou. Notre Dame has a quarterback transfer about every other year. Paulus, we expect to be at Notre Dame for at least 4 years. If he's the number 3 guy for the first 3 seasons of his Notre Dame career, we would still expect him to stick around. So you feel good with the insurance with Paulus. Rivals.com's Josh Hemholt spoke in a recent video on our YouTube page about, and you can check that out on blueandgold.com on our YouTube. He's talking about the sleeper of the class. He thinks Ron Paulus is the real deal. And then, of course, Tyler Buchner, a heralded big-time recruit. So how you feeling about these two freshmen, Lou?
Well, it's kind of what you mentioned about Ron. Is I see it very similar to some recent quarterbacks. Nolan Henry, who was also a holder here, and Montgomery Van Gorder. They could have received scholarship offers at other schools, and they could play at a Power 5 level. I mean, Nolan Henry won some national awards, but they went to Notre Dame for reasons beyond just the football aspect. Obviously, Montgomery's father was the defensive coordinator here at the time, and then Nolan Henry for the academic results. With Ron, you're getting somebody where you don't really have to worry about having that ultimatum that, hey, if I don't start by my sophomore year, I'm leaving. Because this is the way college football really works, especially at the quarterback position. Somebody is going to transfer next year after Jack Coan leaves, because Drew Pyne was a 4-star quarterback. Brendan Clark, he's entering a third, fourth year in the program there. Tyler Buchner. Nobody wants to say. Everybody looks at a Joe Burrow or a Jalen Hurts or wherever you want to go as far as I could be that guy. I'm curious to see what I would get if I'm a starter someplace else. With Ron, I don't think you have that situation. His father is here. He's a well-respected member of the Notre Dame staff, and his affinity for the school and everything else. He's grew up around here. It's always kind of, for many, a neat deal to be playing where their father is also coaching or as an administrator. So this is just kind of in his blood, and whatever you get beyond that is gravy, really. But he's that insurance policy there. Tyler Buchner, obviously, the expectations are going to be much different. He's coming in with that next big thing label. Although, we've had that many, many times through the years, Phil Dracovic being the most recent. And we'll see how it works out. But as far as expectations, look, the last Notre Dame freshman to play truly meaningful ball was Tommy Rees under Brian Kelly in 2010. And that was mainly because the starter Dane Christ was injured, and the next option was a former walk-on in Nate Montana. So whether it was a 5-star such as Gunnar Kiel in 2012 or Ian Book, less heralded in 2016, you are generally going to be redshirted as a freshman. Although, to me, it really doesn't make that much sense anymore, because you have that 4-game window where you can still play without losing in eligibility. And if you're good enough, hopefully, you don't have to stay around for a 5th year in college.
It seems like, Lou, when you look at Buchner and Paulus, it's like a microcosm of quarterbacks under Brian Kelly. You have the big name, all the awards, all the stats in high school, and Tyler Buchner, highly ranked, like other guys Notre Dame's brought in. Most recently comes to mind Phil Dracovic. And then you have Ron Paulus, the 3-star, the comfortable guy, a la Ian Book, Tommy Rees. And I feel like Notre Dame fans, like, that's kind of how they're looking at this. Would you agree from what you've seen on our message board?
And you can almost insert Drew Pyne in there, even though he was a 4-star, and I believe he was ranked 118th in his class, whereas Buchner was 114. So there's not a great disparity ranking wise in there. It's just that with with Pyne's stature, about 5'11", not as stout perhaps. I think he might be viewed more so in that vein, in that when you had um, Ian Book, he was the guy, the filler in between top 100 guy Brandon Wimbush and top 100 guy Phil Jakovic, and who turned out to be, the stalwart of the group. Same thing with Tommy Rees. He came in between 5-star Dane Christ and then also Everett Golson, who was Brian Kelly's first major quarterback recruit at Notre Dame. But it was Tommy Rees who ended up starting 31 games.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a look on the screen for YouTube audience. Drew Pyne, you see him check in at the Alabama game, Lou, and he looks small, but when you see him in person, I've been able to do so a couple times. He can rip it, and maybe I don't know if he could use an extra inch or two, but and certainly some continued work in the weight room. But I've even been able to see a couple of clips of him throwing the ball with just kind of with some receivers at Notre Dame. And man, I might continue to be impressed with how he can rip the ball, but it's different when you have 6'7" offensive linemen in front of you. So he is certainly someone to keep an eye on. And I think that leads us naturally into point number 2 here, the X factor of this group. I think there's 2 guys to look at, and we're really looking at this spring, Lou, who's the X factor. So when we talk about running backs, Logan Diggs and Audric Estime, we won't really touch on because they're not going to be here in the spring. But all 5 of your scholarship quarterbacks are going to be here in the spring and already are at Notre Dame. So we agree Jack Coan's probably your number 1 guy right now. They'll say all the right things, and the coaches will, and let it be an open competition. But it's probably going to be Jack Coan as the starting quarterback in Notre Dame. And in a fight for number 2, if Brendan Clark is out, like we anticipate, it seems like Drew Pyne versus Tyler Buchner.
Yeah, I think that would be the area that would be of greater intrigue. But you could really make a case for any one of the 5 as an X factor. Brendan Clark, how does he come back? Because X factor is defined as the unknown, and I think nothing is going to be more of the unknown than how he's able to recuperate and function, whether it's in the spring or in August once he returns as well. But I think probably the safest pick there would be Drew Pyne, because once again, he's what I call that middle child syndrome. He's in between the new toy, which is Tyler Buchner, that there's always going to be much more attention lavished upon, and then Jack Coan, who is considered the heir and the stopgap or the bridge, however you want to phrase it, for the 2021 season. So it's like, okay, where does Drew Pyne come into this? Is he going to have that Ian Book-like type of career where, okay, Brandon Wimbush, top 100, Phil Jakovic, top 100, in between, and he's the middle child who, hey, has the 35 starts in between. He supplants Wimbush from the starting position, and he holds off Phil Jakovic from overtaking him.
See, I think X factors. I think the knee of Brendan Clark, big X factor. The progression of Drew Pyne, certainly an X factor. And I think you got to look at the hype of Tyler Buchner. This is a guy who did not have a senior season due to California shutting down fall sports due to COVID-19 related concerns. California is playing this spring, but Buchner decided to enroll early, and I think that was a smart choice. There's no guarantee, even though California is playing, there's still no guarantees that he would get a full season in or what that looks like. So get him to Notre Dame. I think that was a good choice, but I think the just how ready Tyler Buchner is a huge X factor because, you know, if Jack Coan were to go down, could Tyler Buchner start games as a true freshman? I think that'll be a huge thing that the staff will get somewhat of an answer to see how ready he is to play against this competition. Because also, Lou, on the experience factor, competition in small ball San Diego was not very good and only had 1 year of starting quarterback experience there. He started as a junior, accounted for 81 touchdowns, was phenomenal. Sophomore season, injured his ACL on the fourth play of the first game, was out the rest of the season, and freshman season was a safety and a receiver. So he's a big unknown.
Yeah, when you go over 4 years like that in high school, and you only have one season, one full varsity season of playing, and didn't even participate your senior year, no fault of his own. There's just so much in the way of timing, movement. Players always are going to talk about how the speed of the game just elevates to such a higher level, and the fact that you also weren't able to have a senior season at all, I think it compounds it even more.
So I think that's about wrapping up those five in terms of the X factor. I think another thing maybe to mention with Buckner is the throwing mechanics. You know, people were questioning him at the Elite 11, which I saw every throw that Tyler had at the Elite 11 and certainly seemed like his velocity was off. Something was off. So another thing to keep in mind with Tyler Buchner. Wrapping up here, Lou. A question that's probably impossible to answer right now is this unit right now going into spring improved from the quarterback room in 2020? So obviously you have Drew Pyne, a year older, year better, Brendan Clark. You have the incoming true freshman. So you feel better about those four, right? You're bringing in two more guys, and then Pyne and Clark are a year older. And you bring in Jack Coan as well with all of his experience, but then you lose Ian Book, the school's all-time leader in wins as starting quarterback. So, do you have an answer there, Lou?
If I had, it would be probably leaning a little more to, the advantage was more so in 2020, just because you had 2 full years of experience with Ian Book. There was a comfort level that he had with Tommy Reese and vice versa. He knew the receiving core as far as having a chemistry and rhythm, along with the offensive line as well. Whereas Jack Coan, he's got the experience. Look, he has 18 starts compared to Ian Book, who had 23 going into his final season of eligibility. So there's not that great a disparity there, but it's just the familiarity aspect, the leadership. Ian Book already had been a captain in 2019, and he was very, very well respected and liked by his teammates. Whereas Jack, maybe he can develop that, but he doesn't go into the spring. He has to kind of earn that trust over time. Plus, he's got a completely new, virtually new offensive line to deal with, as well as a receiving core that, the top returning receiver, Avery Davis, caught 24 passes last year. So it's not like a veteran crew that he's familiar with there either.
I think my answer is I don't really
And
have.
look, I just want to say, yes, Michael Mayer at 42, but I'm talking about the wideout core.
I think my answer to the question, Lou, is I don't really have one, but I will say I think the ceiling for this group is higher as a whole, but the floor is lower because you mentioned Ian Book. You just knew what you had. Whether that's good or bad, well, that's a different discussion for a different day, and one that Notre Dame fans had all last season. But I think the ceiling's higher for this group with, I've heard really good things about Jack Coan. He's already thrown with some of the receivers and tight ends. Is he already better than Ian Book, like an improved Drew Pyne, the X factor with Tyler Buchner? So I think the ceiling is higher, but the floor is lower with this 2021 quarterback room than Ian Book in 2020 because, again, you knew what you had in Ian Book.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to phrase it.